The billionaire's broken vows, a contract of convenience shattered by passion. Like this video. Subscribe to our channel and comment from where you're watching. Your support helps us tell more powerful stories. Now, let's begin. Imagine a marriage contract with strict rules. 5 years of living together as husband and wife in public, but with no love, no passion, not the slightest intimacy. He, a billionaire CEO, needed a trophy wife to secure his empire. She, a young, innocent, and desperate woman, accepted the deal to save her family. But in the solitude of their wedding night, in the opulence of a bridal suite, meant to be the stage for their charade, the CEO, confronted by his new wife's beauty and vulnerability, felt his own rules begin to crumble. Could a man accustomed to controlling everything resist the temptation to break the contract on the very first night? Part 1. The Ice Pact and the Innocent Bride, an Inevitable Sacrifice. Eleanor Thompson, at just 22 years old, felt like a sleepwalker drifting through the last days of her life as she knew it. Every action, every word, every forced smile seemed to belong to someone else, to a lead actress in a play whose script she hadn't written. Its dialogues felt alien to her, and its ending she completely ignored, though she suspected it would be grim. The setting for this performance was the private chapel of the immense and stately Blackwood Manor, an 18th-century architectural gem, property of the ancient and powerful Sterling family, one of the most influential and, until recently, solid business dynasties in the country. The audience, a select and small group of close family and strategic partners, watched with a mix of curiosity, barely disguised pity, and, in some cases, cold calculation. And the co-star, the man who in just a few hours would become her husband in the eyes of God and the law, was Dominic Sterling, 38, the only and brilliant heir of old Lord Alastair Sterling. He was the current, implacable, and feared CEO of Sterling Global Enterprises, a vast conglomerate with diversified interests in investment banking, renewable energy, and luxury real estate internationally. Dominic Sterling was, for Eleanor, the very personification of power, wealth, and an almost inhuman emotional distance. Tall, with an athletic physique discernible even under the impeccably tailored suits he usually wore, his dark hair, always neatly slicked back, was beginning to show a few silver strands at the temples that, far from aging him, gave him an even more pronounced air of maturity and authority. His gray eyes, penetrating, cold as polished steel, seemed capable of reading anyone's soul, of unraveling their most hidden secrets, and, above all, of calculating their exact value in the complex market of human and business relationships. He was a man accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed without question, a brilliant, almost Machiavellian strategist in the ruthless world of business, but a complete enigma in personal matters. He was known in the most intimate circles for his legendary emotional reserve, his aversion to any kind of lasting emotional commitment, and his apparent inability for tenderness or vulnerability. The marriage between Dominic Sterling and the young, innocent Eleanor Thompson was by no means the fruit of passionate love or romantic courtship. It was, in its rawest and starkest essence, an agreement, a contract coldly negotiated and meticulously drafted between two families in diametrically opposite vital and economic circumstances. Eleanor's family, the Thompsons, once respected and prosperous landowners from a Scottish Highlands province, with a family history linked to quality whiskey production, now found themselves on the verge of total ruin, in the absolute depths of despair. A series of consecutive bad harvests, coupled with disastrous management and accumulated gambling debts by Eleanor's father, Lord Robert Thompson, a kind-hearted but dreamy, naive, and terribly impractical man for business, had brought the family to the brink of financial abyss. The bank threatened to foreclose on their ancestral estate, Whispering Pines Distillery, the only remaining asset. The home where Eleanor and her younger siblings had grown up. The only lifeline, the sole and desperate hope they had left, lay in an old and almost forgotten marriage pact that united the Sterling and Thompson families for several generations. An agreement sealed by their respective great-grandparents in times of similar difficulties, which stipulated that, in case of extreme need for one of the families, a member of the other would unite in marriage to ensure the continuity of both lineages and the mutual protection of their patrimony. An archaic, almost feudal tradition, which had remained dormant for decades, but which Lord Robert, in his desperation, had decided to dust off as a last resort. Dominic Sterling, upon being informed by his grandfather, the elderly and still very influential patriarch, Lord Alistair Sterling, of the existence of this commitment and the delicate situation of the Thompsons, had initially resisted with all his might. He, a man of the 21st century, a champion of pragmatism and efficiency, a confirmed bachelor who valued his independence above all else and who saw marriage as an obsolete institution, a trap for the unwary, and a hindrance to his meteoric career. He had not the slightest intention of tying himself for life to an unknown country girl just to fulfill an ancestral promise he considered ridiculous. But the pressure from Lord Alistair, a man of honor and word for whom family pacts were sacred and unbreakable, coupled with the subtle but constant insinuation that non-compliance with said agreement could have very negative consequences for the cohesion and public image of the board of directors of Sterling Global Enterprises, where some very influential members still greatly valued traditions and a gentleman's word, had forced him to reconsider his initial blunt refusal. Furthermore, his own lawyers and advisors had made him see, with cold financial arguments, that a marriage to a young woman from a good family, although fallen on hard times, and the subsequent image of a settled and responsible man that it would project, could be beneficial for certain international businesses, and to silence some persistent rumors about his supposed inability for personal commitment, rumors that, although he despised them, were beginning to be a small hindrance to his public image. Finally, after a long and tense family negotiation where each clause was debated with the same coldness with which a business merger would be discussed, Dominic had agreed to marry Eleanor Thompson, but under his own very strict conditions that he himself took care to dictate to his lawyers so that they would be reflected in a private marriage contract, a document parallel to the legal one that Eleanor would have to sign without question. It would be a marriage of pure convenience, a farce for public consumption, and, above all, for his grandfather and the board of directors. The duration of the agreement would be 5 years, the minimum time Lord Alistair considered necessary to give an appearance of stability, and for, hopefully, an heir to be born who would ensure the continuity of the Sterling lineage at the head of the empire. During those 5 years, Eleanor would play the role of perfect wife, accompany him to essential social events, maintain a public image of discretion, elegance, and impeccable respectability, and refrain from any behavior that could damage the reputation of the Sterling family or Sterling Global Enterprises. In exchange for this service, Dominic would not only completely and immediately clear all the Thompson family's debts, ensuring the survival of Whispering Pines Distillery, and providing them with a generous monthly allowance that would allow them to live comfortably, but he would also grant Eleanor herself a considerable personal allowance and unlimited access to his accounts for wardrobe and representation expenses. But, and this was the most important clause for Dominic, the red line he was not willing to cross under any circumstances. The marriage would be strictly platonic. A formal cohabitation, yes, under the same roof of the imposing Sterling Manor, but in separate rooms, with completely independent private lives. There would be no physical intimacy of any kind, no emotional ties, no expectations of a future together beyond the 5 years stipulated in the contract. At the end of that period, they would divorce as discreetly and civilized as possible, and Eleanor would receive a substantial final sum, a kind of compensation for services rendered that would allow her to rebuild her life with total economic independence and far from him. Eleanor, upon being informed by her father of the terms of the agreement, felt her world crumble at her feet. The idea of selling herself, of giving 5 years of her youth to a man she did not love, and who clearly did not love her, in exchange for her family's economic salvation, repulsed and terrified her in equal measure. She was a virgin, not only in the physical sense, but also emotionally. Her knowledge of love and relationships was limited to the romance novels she secretly devoured in her village library and the idealized dreams of a young woman who had barely begun to glimpse life. Marrying a man like Dominic Sterling, almost 20 years older than her, with a reputation for being cold, distant, and a womanizer, though always very discreetly, seemed like a nightmare. But then, she saw the look of desperation in her father's eyes, the silent anguish of her mother, the shadow of poverty and humiliation hanging over her younger siblings. And she knew she had no choice. For love of her family, for loyalty to her parents, for a sense of duty instilled in her since childhood, she accepted the sacrifice. She signed the marriage contract and the private agreement with Dominic Sterling with a trembling hand, but with a strange and cold determination, feeling that she was signing the death warrant of her own youth, of her own happiness. A cold wedding night and a shocking turn. The wedding ceremony, held in the private chapel of Blackwood Manor with barely 30 guests, was a perfect reflection of the nature of their union. Elegant to the extreme, sumptuous in every detail, impeccably organized, but completely devoid of any hint of spontaneous joy or genuine emotion. Eleanor walked towards the altar arm in arm with a visibly affected Lord Robert, feeling like an automaton, her pale and beautiful face hidden behind an antique lace veil that had belonged to her great-grandmother. Dominic waited for her at the foot of the altar with an impassive, almost bored expression, his gray eyes scanning her with an analytical coldness that made her shiver despite the warmth of the candles. The wedding vows, the standard ones that said nothing of the heart, sounded hollow, mechanical, like the clauses of another business contract. The reception, an exquisite lunch served in the impressive halls of the estate, was a parade of forced smiles, superficial conversations, and formal toasts to the happy union and the promising future of the newlyweds. Eleanor tried with all her might to play her new role with the utmost dignity, responding to congratulations with rehearsed politeness, enduring the curious, often compassionate, and sometimes malicious glances of the guests, most of whom were Dominic's business associates or members of high society whom she barely knew. Dominic, by her side, acted as the perfect host, attentive and courteous to all, exuding charm and power, but always maintaining an impassable, almost palpable distance from her, his brand-new wife. Finally, when the last guest had left, and the immense estate was plunged into an expectant and somewhat ominous silence, the moment Eleanor so dreaded arrived, and at the same time, and this deeply shamed her, secretly yearned for, with a mix of primal dread and an almost childlike and inappropriate curiosity. Their wedding night. The real beginning of her new life, of her condemnation, or, who knew, perhaps of something completely unexpected. Dominic accompanied her, without saying a single word during the brief car ride from Blackwood Manor to what would be their new residence, the legendary Stirling estate in the exclusive Chelsea district of London. Upon arrival, he led her through the long, sumptuous, and silent corridors, their footsteps echoing on the polished marble, to the east wing of the mansion, where, he informed her with a coldness that admitted no reply, would be her personal suite. A magnificent room, exquisitely decorated in cream and gold tones, with a huge bay window overlooking the gardens and a four-poster bed that seemed straight out of a princess's fairy tale. A gilded cage, Eleanor thought with a shiver. "This will be your room for the next 5 years, Eleanor," he said, his voice deep and completely neutral, stopping at the threshold without crossing it. "As you can see, you have everything you could possibly need. There's a full dressing room with clothes and accessories my personal assistant has arranged for you, a marble bathroom with every imaginable product, and a small sitting room attached in case you wish to receive discreet visitors, of course. My rooms, as I've already explained in detail and as stated in our agreement, are in the west wing of the house, at the other end of the corridor. You don't need to worry about my physical presence at all, unless it's strictly necessary for a public appearance or an unavoidable family event. We will lead completely separate and independent lives under this roof." He paused, and his gray eyes, now colder and harder than ever, fixed on hers with an intensity that made her tremble from head to toe despite the suffocating heat she suddenly felt. "And, of course, Eleanor, the most important clause of our agreement, the one I hope you have understood and accepted without any reservation, remains and will remain in force for the entire duration of this marriage," he said, pronouncing the last word with a slight hint of sarcasm. "There will be no intimate contact of any kind between us. None. This is a marriage of convenience, remember that always. A necessary business transaction for both families. Nothing more. Has this been crystal clear to you? I hope I don't have to repeat myself." Eleanor nodded silently, unable to speak, feeling an icy knot form in her throat, suffocating the few fragile hopes that, despite everything, she might still harbor in some secret corner of her young and battered heart. Dominic's words, so direct, so cruel in their calculated coldness, were like a slap across her face, like a bucket of icy water that abruptly returned her to the harsh and desolate reality of her situation. "Perfectly clear, Mr. Stirling," she finally managed to say, her voice barely a trembling whisper, her blue eyes brimming with tears she desperately fought to hold back. "Good," he said, with a slight and imperceptible nod, as if closing another business deal. "In that case, I wish you good night, Eleanor, and welcome, I suppose, unconventional as it may be, to the illustrious Stirling family. Rest well. Tomorrow will be a long day, and my grandfather will want to see you to give you an official welcome." He turned then, intending to leave and abandon her in that immense and luxurious gilded cage that would be her home and her prison for the next 5 years. And Eleanor felt her heart break into 1,000 pieces, her soul shrinking with a loneliness and despair so profound that she thought she couldn't bear it. But then, just as Dominic Stirling reached the threshold of the door, about to cross it and disappear back into his world of ice and business, something completely unexpected, something that defied all logic and rational explanation, happened. Perhaps it was the sight of Eleanor's almost childlike fragility, standing in the middle of that sumptuous room, in her unaltered wedding dress, looking like a broken and abandoned porcelain doll. Perhaps it was the subtle, sweet scent of jasmine and recent tears emanating from her skin. Or perhaps, simply, it was a primal impulse, a visceral and uncontrollable reaction to so many years of self-imposed solitude, of emotions repressed to the limit, of a denied desire that suddenly struggled to surface with the force of a volcano. But Dominic Sterling, the man of ice, the CEO who never lost control, who had sworn never to feel anything for any woman again, stopped dead in his tracks, as if an invisible force had anchored him to the ground. He turned slowly, very slowly, and looked at Eleanor again. And this time, his gaze was neither cold, nor distant, nor calculating. There was a new light in his gray eyes, a spark of something Eleanor couldn't identify, something that frightened and attracted her at the same time, something that dangerously resembled raw desire, forbidden curiosity, an urgent and inexplicable need to break all his own rules at that very instant, to defy the contract that he himself, with such coldness and precision, had imposed just minutes before. He walked slowly towards her, his steps now less firm, almost hesitant, as if he were fighting an internal battle. Eleanor watched him, her heart pounding wildly in her chest, a mixture of paralyzing fear and a strange, new excitement coursing through her entire body. What was he going to do? What did that look mean? That unexpected and threatening closeness when he was in front of her, just inches away, so close that Eleanor could feel the heat emanating from his body and the masculine scent of his skin. Dominic raised a hand, a large, strong hand, and with a delicacy that surprised and thrilled her to her core, he gently brushed away a rebellious lock of hair that fell across her tear-dampened forehead. His fingers, warm and firm, grazed her skin, and both felt a small but intense electric shock, an involuntary tremor that ran through them from head to toe, betraying the accumulated tension and latent desire. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice now hoarse, deep, laden with an unknown, almost guttural emotion. You are incredibly beautiful. Much more beautiful and much more desirable than I remembered, or than I had allowed myself to admit." She looked at him, her large blue eyes, still bright from recent tears, wide as saucers, unable to articulate a single word, lost in the disconcerting intensity of those gray eyes that now devoured her with a mixture of raw desire, palpable confusion, and a vulnerability she had never seen in him before. "I know perfectly well what I said just a few minutes ago, Eleanor. I know what the strict rules of our agreement are," he continued, his warm breath with a slight scent of expensive brandy dangerously brushing her flushed cheek. "But tonight, here and now, looking at you like this, so fragile, so innocent, so irresistible, tonight, Eleanor, I'm not at all sure I can fulfill them. What's more, I'm not sure I want to fulfill them at all." And before she could react, before she could even process the full meaning and implications of his words, Dominic Sterling, the man who had sworn to keep her at a safe distance, the CEO who had bought his wife as if she were a valuable but impersonal property of his vast empire, lowered his head and, defying all his own rules, all his fears, all his ghosts from the past, he kissed her, a kiss that began with surprising timidity, almost a tentative exploration of lips that barely touched, but which soon, very soon, transformed into a whirlwind of passion contained for too long, of desire accumulated during years of self-imposed solitude and brutally repressed emotions. A kiss that shattered in an instant all the rules, all the contracts, all the invisible barriers he himself had erected. A kiss that changed everything, absolutely everything, in one single, unforgettable, forbidden, and momentous wedding night. The contract, shattered, a night of revelation. The impact of that unexpected, hungry, and surprisingly tender kiss left Eleanor completely breathless, her mind spinning in a delicious and terrifying whirlwind of disbelief and a wave of physical and emotional sensations she had never before, not even in her boldest dreams, experienced. Dominic's arms, which at first had held her with a mixture of almost irreverent hesitation and barely contained strength, now wrapped around her with unequivocal possessiveness, firmly drawing her against his muscular, warm body, eliminating any hint of physical distance that might still remain between them. His lips, which had begun by exploring hers with a surprising and almost painful tenderness, now moved with passionate urgency, claiming, devouring, as if they had spent years, entire decades, yearning for that forbidden contact, that denied taste. Eleanor, a virgin and innocent not only in body, but also of the complexities of adult desire, felt overwhelmed, frightened by the intensity of her own reactions, but also, and this confused and excited her even more, strangely, irresistibly, alive. Never had anyone kissed her like this, with such overwhelming intensity, with such palpable hunger, with such barely contained desperation. Her body, despite her stunned mind and fears, began to respond instinctively, almost primally, to the expert caress of that man, to the intoxicating closeness of that powerful body that seemed to radiate a scorching heat that melted her from within. A part of her, the most rational, the most frightened, the one that remembered the cold clauses of the contract, screamed at her to pull away, to stop him, to remind him of the rules. But another part, a much older, much deeper, and much more powerful part, a part of her being that had remained dormant and yearning for too long, felt irresistibly drawn by the force of his desire, by the implicit promise of a passion she had never known, of a surrender she had never allowed herself to dream of. When they finally separated, or rather, when Dominic interrupted the kiss with a ragged gasp, both were breathing heavily, their gazes locked on each other, laden with a mix of immense surprise, palpable confusion, and an electric, almost unbearable tension that filled every corner of the luxurious and now too small bridal suite. "Dominic," Eleanor managed to whisper, her voice trembling and barely recognizable, her lips swollen and sensitive from the force of that kiss that had changed everything. This wasn't in our agreement. You yourself said there wouldn't be, that we couldn't." "I know, Eleanor. I know perfectly well. Damn it, what I said," he interrupted her, his voice now hoarse, deep, guttural, his gray eyes shining with a dark, feverish, and intense light that made her tremble from head to toe. "But sometimes, my dear and innocent wife, rules are simply made to be broken, and sometimes the most carefully drafted agreements simply cease to make the slightest sense in the face of something much stronger, much more real." And without giving her time to react, without giving her a chance to protest or flee, he lifted her into his arms with surprising ease, as if she weighed no more than a feather, and carried her, with a firm and determined step, towards the enormous four-poster bed that dominated the room, the very symbol of their unconsummated marriage. He gently, almost reverently, placed her on the cool, soft silk sheets and leaned over her, his face inches from hers, his intense gaze devouring her. "Tonight, Eleanor," he whispered, his warm breath with a slight scent of expensive brandy dangerously brushing her parted lips. Forget the damned contract. Forget all the stupid rules I myself imposed. Forget everything and everyone, except me, and you, and what, inevitably, is about to happen between us at this very moment. Because I assure you, my dear, beautiful, and surprisingly strong wife, that this will be a wedding night neither of us, as long as we live, will ever forget. And Dominic Sterling, the billionaire CEO who had bought his wife as if she were a valuable but impersonal property, but who now, to his own absolute astonishment, felt irresistibly possessed by her innocence, by her beauty, by her unexpected strength, more than fulfilled his word. That night he broke each and every one of his self-imposed rules, defied all previous agreements, and consummated his marriage with Eleanor in a way so passionate, so tender in its ferocity, and so profoundly transformative for both of them, that by dawn, when the first timid light of day began to filter through the heavy curtains of the sumptuous suite, nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same for either of them. The cold and calculating ice contract had shattered, had melted under the fire of an unexpected passion, and in its place, between the tangled sheets and the muffled whispers of an unforgettable night, had begun to be born, in the most improbable and surprising way, the fragile but immensely powerful seed of a true love, a love that threatened to change everything. A cold reality and a secret passion. When Eleanor woke up the next morning, the first timid rays of a winter sun filtered with difficulty through the heavy velvet curtains of the sumptuous bridal suite, painting the room in shades of gray and gold. She found herself alone in the immense four-poster bed, the Egyptian cotton sheets, once impeccable, now tangled and wrinkled, silent witnesses to the storm of passions that had erupted the night before. For a fleeting instant, a melancholic and almost incredulous smile curved her lips as she remembered, she thought, or rather wished with all her might, that it had all been an incredibly vivid dream, a fantasy woven by her solitary imagination and the accumulated tension of the wedding and her strange destiny. But the slight and pleasant ache she felt in every muscle of her body, the intimate warmth that still lingered between the sheets, and the vivid, almost palpable memory down to the last detail of Dominic's ardent caresses, deep kisses, and total surrender, confirmed with overwhelming certainty that the previous night had been painfully, wonderfully, undeniably real. She had married a man she barely knew under the terms of a cold and humiliating contract that forbade any kind of intimacy. And that same man, her husband of convenience, had broken each and every one of his own rules on their wedding night, dragging her with him into a whirlwind of sensations and emotions she had never before experienced, not even in her boldest and most secret fantasies. She slowly sat up in bed, hugging her knees to her naked chest beneath the thin silk sheet, feeling a dizzying and deeply contradictory mix of emotions that left her breathless. There was shame, yes, a stinging and almost paralyzing shame for having given herself with such apparent ease, with so little resistance, to a man who, until just a few hours ago, was practically a complete stranger to her, a man who, moreover, had bought her with a contract that made her, in her own eyes, little more than a luxury commodity. There was profound confusion over Dominic's erratic and disconcerting behavior, over the unexpected and overwhelming passion that had emerged between them from nothing, defying all rules, all logic, all expectations. And also, deep down in her young and stunned heart, and this was what frightened and disturbed her most, there was a nascent, fragile, and dangerous seed of hope. The hope, almost a silent plea to destiny, that magical night, that intense and real connection they had shared, had not been just a momentary outburst of desire on his part, a simple slip in his iron self-control, but the true and authentic beginning of something more, of something real, of something that could resemble, however remotely, a real marriage. Perhaps even. She dared to dream for an instant. Love. But when Dominic Sterling finally appeared in the suite, several hours later, when Eleanor had already showered with almost boiling water, trying unsuccessfully to erase the trace of his caresses from her skin, and had dressed in one of the simple but elegant day dresses they had prepared for her, his expression was once again that of the cold, distant, controlled, and impenetrable CEO she remembered from their few and formal pre-wedding encounters. There was not the slightest trace on his impassive face of the unrestrained passion, the surprising tenderness, the almost childlike vulnerability he had shown her the night before in the protective intimacy of darkness. He was impeccably dressed in one of his usual and expensive dark suits, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his dark hair slicked back without a single strand out of place. The ice armor of the businessman was back firmly in place, as if the previous night had never existed. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, his tone formal, almost impersonal, as if addressing another employee, still a stranger. He didn't even look her directly in the eyes. "I hope you rested well. The staff has prepared breakfast in the private dining room in this wing. We need to talk, calmly and rationally, about the agenda for the next few days. As you well know, there are several unavoidable social commitments we will need to attend together as husband and wife in the coming weeks. It is vitally important for the image of the company and the Sterling family that we project an image of unity, harmony, and normality." Eleanor looked at him, feeling all her nascent and fragile hopes vanish like the smoke of a newly extinguished candle, as if ice reformed around her, denser, colder, and sharper than before. Was it possible that he had regretted it so soon, so completely? That for him, that night of surrender and passion had meant absolutely nothing more than a simple lapse, a momentary and regrettable breach of his own ironclad rules, a carnal whim satisfied and quickly forgotten? The idea wounded her deeply, much more than she would have wanted to admit, leaving her with a feeling of humiliation and emptiness even deeper and more bitter than she had felt when signing that infamous contract. "Dominic," she began, her voice trembling, barely a whisper, as she fought with all her might to contain the tears of disappointment and a dull rage that threatened to erupt. "About what happened last night, between us. I need to talk about it." "What happened last night, Eleanor?" He interrupted her abruptly, his gaze now cold, distant, and completely evasive, not meeting hers, as if he feared seeing in her eyes the reflection of his own weakness, of his own betrayal of his principles. It was a mistake, a regrettable and inexcusable error on my part, a momentary weakness that should not have happened, and that, I solemnly assure you, with all the firmness of my word, will not be repeated under any circumstances. Forget it. Please, erase it from your memory. We still have a contract to fulfill, appearances to maintain for the next 5 years, and I would greatly appreciate it, for both our sakes and for the stability of our respective families, if we adhered strictly to its original terms from this very instant. Absolute discretion, as you will recall, was one of the fundamental and non-negotiable clauses of our agreement. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have an enormous amount of work waiting for me in my office. There's an important merger that requires my full attention. With your permission, and without another word, without a single apology for the calculated cruelty of his words, without a hint of the tenderness and passion he had shown her just hours before in the darkness of the night. He turned with an almost martial rigidity and left the room with a firm, determined step, leaving her alone, standing in the middle of that luxurious, gilded cage that would be her home and her prison for the next 5 years, her heart broken into 1,000 pieces, and a feeling of humiliation, desolation, and profound loneliness, even more intense and bitter than before. So that was it. A mistake. A simple and regrettable mistake that she had to forget, that she had to erase from her memory, as if it were so easy, as if it were possible, to erase from her skin the memory of every forbidden caress, every stolen kiss, every word whispered in the complicit darkness of the night. The tears of rage, pain, and a deep and bitter disappointment began to roll uncontrollably down her pale cheeks. She felt more alone, more used, more miserable, and above all, more incredibly foolish than ever in her young and innocent life. How could she have been so naive, so stupid, as to believe, even for a single, fleeting instant, that a man like Dominic Sterling, a man made of ice and ambition, could come to feel something remotely akin to affection, or even simple desire, for her, for a simple country girl sold like common merchandise to save her family's honor and fortune. The days and weeks that followed that fateful and confusing wedding night were a true and refined emotional torture for Eleanor. Dominic, true to his word, returned to being the distant, cold, and indifferent husband he had been before, perhaps even more formal, more secretive, more inaccessible, as if he wanted to erase with every gesture of calculated indifference any trace, any memory, of the intimacy that, to his deep regret and remorse, they had shared. They fulfilled their public appearances as the happy and impeccable Sterling couple, smiling professionally for the cameras of the tabloids, exchanging kind words and gestures of studied and perfect complicity at gala dinners, charity events, and meetings of the Sterling Global Enterprises Board of Directors. But as soon as they crossed the threshold of the imposing Sterling Manor in Chelsea, as soon as the solid oak doors closed and the annoying witnesses disappeared, the glacial silence and the insurmountable distance became the crushing norm again, the painful reality of their cohabitation. And the nights were a true and lonely agony for Eleanor. Alone in her immense and cold four-poster bed, she tossed and turned between the silk sheets, unable to sleep, remembering with a clarity that tormented her every forbidden caress, every stolen kiss, every word whispered in the complicit darkness of that one night of passion. And she felt how the fragile hope that, despite all the pain and humiliation, had been born in her young heart that night, slowly withered day after day, drowned by Dominic's cruel, calculated, and constant indifference. She began to wonder if she had gone mad, if perhaps she had imagined the surprising tenderness in his gray eyes, the unexpected passion in his kisses, the almost childlike vulnerability in his voice when he confessed his deepest fears in the dim light of the room. Or was he simply a consummate actor, a skilled and unscrupulous manipulator, capable of feigning emotions he didn't feel at all, just to satisfy a momentary whim, a carnal impulse, to then coldly discard her like a broken toy, like a worthless object? The doubt consumed her, tormented her, a glimmer of hope and a secret talent. What Eleanor didn't know, what she couldn't remotely imagine in her innocence and pain, was that Dominic Sterling was fighting his own fierce internal battle, a silent and merciless war against his own demons, against his own feelings. That night with her, that unexpected and total surrender, had affected him much more deeply, much more viscerally than he was willing to admit, even to himself in the solitude of his office in the wee hours of the morning. It had awakened in him sensations, emotions, feelings he believed dead and buried many, many years ago, ever since the painful and humiliating betrayal of Lydia, his first and only fiancée. The woman who had broken his heart into 1,000 pieces and had taught him, in the worst possible way, to distrust love, intimacy, vulnerability, the ingrained fear of suffering again, of being deceived again, of showing himself vulnerable to another woman and having her use his feelings against him, was stronger, much more powerful at that moment than any other nascent emotion. That's why he had closed himself off again so abruptly and cruelly from Eleanor. That's why he had rebuilt his walls of ice, higher and thicker than ever. Because truly getting close to Eleanor, allowing himself to love her, allowing himself to feel something as intense and real as what he had begun to feel confusedly on that wedding night, meant risking potentially unbearable pain, an emotional devastation from which perhaps, this time, he might not recover. And that was a risk he consciously was not willing to take again. He preferred the controlled and predictable solitude of his business world, the cold and secure company of his financial statements and market strategies, to the chaotic, unpredictable, and potentially devastating uncertainty of love. But the memory of that night, the indelible image of Eleanor in his arms, vulnerable and surrendered, the sweet and forbidden taste of her lips, the incredible softness of her skin under his hands, the way her innocent but surprisingly passionate body had responded to his with a naturalness and surrender that had completely disarmed him. All of that haunted him day and night, like a persistent and seductive ghost. He found himself thinking about her at the most unexpected moments, getting distracted by her image in the middle of crucial business meetings, unconsciously seeking her silent presence in the wide and solitary corridors of the mansion, with a growing anxiety that baffled and deeply irritated him. And sometimes, very late at night, when he believed everyone in the house was asleep and no one could see him in his moment of weakness, he would stealthily approach, like a furtive thief, the closed door of Eleanor's room and stand there in the darkness of the hallway, listening to the faint and almost imperceptible sound of her quiet breathing, yearning, desiring, fighting with all the strength of his will against the irrepressible, almost painful impulse to enter, to take her in his arms again, to break, 1,000 times if necessary, his own stupid self-imposed rules. Meanwhile, Eleanor, determined not to let herself be consumed by sadness, humiliation, and despair, and with an inner strength she didn't even know she possessed, began to desperately seek a way out, a way to fill the immense emptiness of her days and nights in that gilded cage. She remembered her old passion for jewelry design and creation, a delicate and meticulous hobby she had cultivated with true care and surprising talent in her youth. Before her family's financial difficulties and life's urgencies forced her to abandon everything to seek more practical and remunerated jobs. With the generous monthly allowance Dominic provided, the only part of the contract he fulfilled with scrupulous and almost offensive punctuality, and with the much free time she had in that mansion that felt more like a luxury convent than a home, Eleanor began to take private lessons with a renowned elderly goldsmith in the traditional Hatton Garden district, a master artisan of the old school, who still worked with ancestral techniques and who soon recognized in her a natural gift and an exquisite sensitivity for the art of jewelry. She enthusiastically bought the necessary materials, small quantities of sterling gold and silver, some subtle colored semi-precious stones, specialized tools with strange and evocative names. And in the small, bright abandoned conservatory at the back of the immense mansion garden, a space that the housekeeper, Higgins, had allowed her to use discreetly, and which Eleanor soon transformed into her private workshop, she began to give free rein to her creativity, her imagination, her need to express all the beauty and melancholy she carried within. And she discovered, with surprising and almost forgotten joy, that she had an innate talent, a special connection with metals and stones, an exquisite sensitivity for jewelry design. Her creations were original, elegant, with a touch of romantic melancholy that made them unique, and with a delicacy in the details that reflected the complexity of her own sensitive, wounded but not broken soul. Each piece that came from her hands, after hours of patient work and dedication, seemed to tell a story, express an emotion, capture an instant of ephemeral beauty. The jewelry workshop became her refuge, her sanctuary, the only place in the world where she felt truly herself. Free, creative, mistress of her own time and her own destiny. There, surrounded by noble metals that bent under fire and hammer to acquire new forms, by precious stones waiting to be set to reveal all their hidden brilliance, by ancient tools that seemed to whisper secrets of an ancestral and almost forgotten art. Eleanor slowly began to heal her wounds, to rebuild her shattered self-esteem, to find a new hope, a new purpose for her life, beyond the cold walls of her marriage of convenience, and her creations, increasingly refined, more personal, more beautiful, and full of deep meaning, began to attract the attention not only of her elderly and wise master, who saw in her a true artist with a brilliant future, but also, completely unexpectedly, of some of the few people with whom Eleanor maintained discreet social contact, such as the wife of one of Dominic's lawyers, a sensitive woman, and art lover who was captivated by a brooch Eleanor had designed. Dominic, of course, remained completely oblivious to this new and secret facet of his wife's life. He continued immersed in his multi-million-dollar businesses, in his constant travels around the world, and in his solitary and self-imposed internal struggle against feelings he refused to acknowledge, but which, like an underground tide, grew stronger, more insistent, more difficult to ignore every day. But fate, that tireless weaver of invisible and often ironic threads, was about to cross their paths again in a completely unexpected way. Through a major social event that would test, once again, and perhaps definitively, the solidity of his emotional walls and the true and undeniable nature of the feelings that both, with such eagerness and so much fear, strove so hard to deny and keep hidden. The night of the Duchess of Cornwall's grand masked ball was approaching, and with it, a new opportunity for the broken contract to give way, perhaps to a much deeper and more transformative truth. The grand masked ball, a hidden gem, revealed the Duchess of Cornwall, Lady Eleanor Fitzwilliam, was one of the great ladies of British high society, a woman of impeccable taste, sharp wit, and considerable influence in the circles of art, fashion, and philanthropy. Her annual masked ball, held in her imposing 17th century palace in the heart of London, was the most anticipated and exclusive social event of the year, a night where power, wealth, and glamour met under the seductive anonymity of masks and elaborate costumes. For Dominic Sterling, attending this ball was an unavoidable social and professional obligation. The Duchess was an important client of his investment bank and a key figure in several of the foundations he chaired. And of course, as protocol dictated and his own newly awakened possessive instinct prompted, he had to do so accompanied by his wife, the increasingly enigmatic and surprising Eleanor Thompson. When Dominic informed Eleanor, with a formality that could no longer completely hide a new nuance of interest in his gaze, of the date and importance of the ball, she received him with her usual educated apparent indifference, though inside she felt a slight and almost imperceptible shiver of anticipation. It had been a long time, an eternity, since she had attended a party of that magnitude, an event where she could, even if only for a few hours, feel a little like the protagonist of one of those romance novels she loved so much. "I've ordered a dress for you from Madame Valerie, your favorite designer, or at least the one you seem to like most lately," Dominic told her, with a tone that pretended to be casual, but couldn't hide a new and strange consideration for her tastes. "And as for the jewels, I suppose that, as consort hostess of one of the main sponsors of the event, you'll want to wear something special, something that lives up to the occasion. You can choose whatever you want from the family safe. There are historical pieces of incalculable value." Eleanor looked at him, and a bold idea, almost a small and secret mischief, a way to reaffirm her own newly recovered identity, flashed through her mind. "Thank you very much for your consideration, Dominic. Madame Valerie's dress will surely be exquisite, as always," she replied, her voice soft, but with a new gleam of determination in her blue eyes. "But as for the jewels, I think this time, if you don't mind, I'll wear something different, something of my own, something I made myself." He raised an eyebrow, visibly surprised by her unexpected statement, but also, and this disconcerted him even more, slightly intrigued. "Something of your own? Do you mean those little things you make in the conservatory?" he asked, trying to make his tone not sound too derogatory, although a part of him still struggled against his old prejudices. "Exactly, Dominic," she confirmed, with a calm that disarmed him. "My little things. I hope they don't embarrass you too much in front of your important friends." He stared at her for an instant, not knowing quite what to say. There was something in her new confidence, in her quiet self-assertion, that attracted and intimidated him in equal measure. Finally, with a shrug that pretended to be indifferent, but failed to hide his curiosity, he said, "As you wish, Eleanor. It's your choice. I just hope you know what you're doing. The Duchess is a very observant woman with impeccable taste." During the weeks leading up to the ball, Eleanor secretly worked in her small conservatory workshop with feverish concentration and passion. She wanted to create something special, something unique, something that was not only beautiful, but also told her own story, the story of her silent transformation. She designed and created for herself an absolutely stunning set of jewels, a masterpiece of artisan goldsmithing that was both modern and timeless. A white gold filigree necklace, delicate as lace, that mimicked a cascade of icy tears, or perhaps morning dew, with a small but intensely brilliant deep blue sapphire, the same color as her eyes, set in the center, like a solitary heart full of an inner light. Matching earrings, long and delicate, that seemed like silver whispers and that sparkled with every slight movement of her head, and an exquisite bracelet that coiled around her wrist like a vine of silver and small Baroque pearls, imperfect but beautiful in their uniqueness. They were pieces of an ethereal beauty, original, elegant to the extreme, and with a touch of romantic melancholy, of fragile strength, that made them unique, unforgettable. They were, in essence, a reflection of her own soul, of the woman she was becoming. On the night of the masked ball, when Eleanor descended the grand marble staircase of Stirling Manor, ready to depart for the Duchess's palace, Dominic, who was waiting for her in the foyer in his usual impeccable tuxedo, was momentarily breathless. Literally. He forgot for an instant the day's tensions, the worries of his business, even the damned contract that still formally bound them. He could only see her. Eleanor wore a deep navy blue silk dress of simple but incredibly elegant lines that adhered to her slender figure like a second skin and enhanced the ivory tone of her bare shoulders and the delicacy of her neck. Her brown hair, usually tied in a discreet bun, was now loose, falling in soft, shimmering waves down her back, adorned only with a small, antique silver and jet hair comb that had belonged to her grandmother. Her makeup was subtle, highlighting the natural beauty of her features and the depth of her blue eyes. And the jewels she wore were simply spectacular. They were not the ostentatious diamonds or flashy emeralds that he used to give her in the past, and that she never wore, keeping them at the bottom of a drawer as if they were golden shackles. These were different, unique, of a subtle but hypnotic beauty that seemed to radiate a light of their own, a light that came from within. Dominic began, his voice hoarse with surprise and an admiration he couldn't and didn't want to disguise. You're absolutely dazzling, Eleanor, more beautiful than ever. Those jewels, I've never seen them before. They are extraordinary. What famous Parisian or Italian designer are they from? They must have cost a fortune. Eleanor smiled, an enigmatic, serene smile, full of a new and quiet self-confidence that Dominic found irresistibly attractive. I'm glad you like them, Dominic, she replied, her voice soft but firm. And no, they're not from any famous designer, nor have they cost a fortune in money. But they have cost many hours of work, dedication, and soul. They are mine. I designed and made them myself, with my own hands. He looked at her, completely astonished, his gray eyes fixed on hers, trying to understand the magnitude of what he had just heard. You made this? These wonders? But how? When? It's my little secret, Dominic, she replied simply, a playful gleam in her eyes. My refuge, the place where I can be myself, without contracts or appearances. A new identity and a reborn love. Throughout the evening in the crowded and dazzling palace of the Duchess of Cornwall, Eleanor was, to the surprise of many and to Dominic's growing pride, the center of all attention, the unexpected star of the night. Not only for her serene beauty and the natural elegance of her attire, but, above all, for the extraordinary and original jewels she wore, which seemed to capture and reflect the light of the chandeliers in a magical way. Several ladies of high society, known for their exquisite taste, infallible judgment, and fondness for high jewelry from the world's most prestigious houses, approached her throughout the night to closely admire the pieces, to reverently touch the filigree of the necklace, to insistently ask for the designer's name, praising without reserve their originality, their beauty, and their impeccable craftsmanship. Eleanor, with charming modesty and an enigmatic invariably replied that they were the work of a young and still unknown local artisan with great talent and a great future. Dominic observed the scene from a discreet distance, with a mixture of emotions that overwhelmed him. He felt immense, almost paternal pride in his wife's success, in the recognition of her talent. He felt astonishment at this unknown facet of Eleanor, at this creative force that had remained hidden for so long. And also, and this disconcerted and disturbed him in equal measure, he felt a pang of jealousy. A strange jealousy, different from what he had felt before. It wasn't jealousy of another man, but jealousy of Eleanor's inner world, of that secret passion, of that talent that she had cultivated in solitude, without him, despite him. a world to which he had had no access, which he had completely ignored. And he realized, with painful clarity, how much he had missed, how much he still had to discover about that surprising woman who was his wife. The culmination of the night, the one that would mark a before and after in the perception that the world, and Dominic himself, had of Eleanor, came when the Duchess of Cornwall herself, a woman of legendary elegance, impeccable taste, and considerable influence in the exclusive world of art and fashion, approached Eleanor with her usual entourage of admirers, and, after carefully examining her necklace through a small gold monocular, exclaimed loudly, for all present to hear clearly, "But dear Eleanor, my creature, these jewels you wear tonight are an authentic, a sublime work of art. They have soul. They have magic. It's been years since I've seen anything so original, so exquisite, so full of personality. Tell me, please, who is the genius, the unknown artist, who created them? I must meet him immediately, and I want to commission a complete collection for my next charity exhibition in Paris." All eyes in the ballroom, full of curiosity and expectation, turned instantly towards Eleanor. She felt for a moment the weight of the attention, the vertigo of recognition. She looked at Dominic for an instant, perhaps seeking a sign, support. And he, from the other side of the room, gave her a slight smile of encouragement, a look full of pride and admiration that filled her with new and brave self-confidence. Then, taking a deep breath, and with a serene and radiant smile that illuminated her face, Eleanor replied to the Duchess, her voice clear and firm, resonating in the expectant silence. "The artisan, your grace, the creator of these modest pieces, is me." A murmur of astonishment, disbelief, and profound admiration swept through the sumptuous ballroom. Dominic felt his heart skip a beat, a wave of pride and an indefinable emotion completely invading him. His wife, the shy and innocent young woman who had come into his life through a cold contract, the woman he had ignored and underestimated for so long, had just revealed herself to the world and to him as an artist of extraordinary talent, as a woman of dazzling inner strength and beauty. In the car ride back to the mansion, the silence between them was no longer cold or tense, as it had been so many other times. It was a different silence, expectant, charged with a new emotion, of unspoken but intuited words. "Eleanor," Dominic finally began, his voice now soft, almost reverent, devoid of any trace of his usual arrogance. "What you did tonight, your talent, is absolutely extraordinary. I had no idea. Why have you never told me? Why have you hidden it from me for so long?" "Because you never asked," Eleanor replied with a simplicity that disarmed him, but without the slightest hint of reproach or bitterness in her voice. "And because, to be completely honest, I think until very recently, you wouldn't have cared in the slightest. And perhaps, just perhaps, I myself needed to believe in myself, in my art, before I could share it with you or with the world until now." He nodded slowly, accepting with a humility that was completely new to him the painful but undeniable truth of her words. "You are absolutely right, as always. I have been blind, foolish, a complete idiot. But my eyes, Eleanor, thanks to you, are finally opening. And what I see now, I like. I like it very much, more than I can express in words." They arrived at the imposing Sterling Manor, and this time, when they ascended the grand marble staircase, Dominic did not automatically veer towards his wing, towards his solitary room. He followed Eleanor, in silence, to the door of her suite. She stopped at the threshold, turned, and looked at him. A silent question. a fearful invitation in her beautiful blue eyes. He took her hand, that small and surprisingly strong hand, that artist's hand that was capable of creating so much beauty and emotion, and gently brought it to his lips, placing a tender, respectful, and deeply yearning kiss on it. "Eleanor," he whispered, his gaze fixed on hers, his gray eyes now full of a warmth, an admiration, and a desire that completely enveloped her, making her feel, for the first time in a long time, truly beautiful, truly desired, truly alive. Tonight I don't want to sleep alone. And if you allow me, I don't want you to sleep alone ever again. Unless you truly wish it with all your heart." She looked at him, and in her honey-colored eyes, once veiled by sadness and resignation, Dominic saw the answer his heart so longed for. He saw nascent forgiveness. He saw reborn hope. He saw the trembling promise of a love that, although late, although born of the strangest and most artificial circumstances, was now, for both, undeniably real, overwhelmingly powerful. "No, Dominic," she replied, her voice barely a trembling whisper, but firm. "No more lonely nights. Not for you, not for me." And together, hand in hand, like two shipwrecked souls finally finding a safe harbor after a long and terrifying storm, they entered the room. And that night, the magical night of the masked ball, the night when Eleanor's secret talent and luminous soul finally came to light, also became the night when the marriage of convenience, the cold and calculating contract of Dominic Sterling and Eleanor Thompson, irrevocably transformed into a union of true love, of refound passion, and of a mutual admiration that promised to last forever. The original contract had been broken, yes, in its spirit and in its letter, but in its place, both, with hearts trembling with emotion and hope, had begun to write, with invisible letters of gold and fire, the first and most beautiful pages of a new and surprising story together. A story whose end was yet to be discovered, but whose beginning, both knew, had been simply perfect. A life transformed, love's true legacy. The night of the masked ball was not just a turning point. It was the true birth of the relationship between Dominic and Eleanor. The passion that had erupted between them, as unexpected as it was overwhelming, did not extinguish with the light of dawn. On the contrary, it seemed to ignite a deeper flame, calmer but equally intense, that of love, respect, and mutual admiration. The days that followed were marked by constant rediscovery. Dominic, stripped of his armor of ruthless ambition, revealed himself as a man with a hidden sensitivity, an ironic humor, and a capacity for tenderness he didn't even know he possessed. Eleanor, in turn, blossomed under Dominic's loving gaze and unconditional support, her talent as a jewelry designer expanding in ways she had never dreamed of, her spirit regaining the joy and confidence that had been snatched from her. Sterling Manor, once a mausoleum of silence and distance, began to fill with life. Formal dinners in the immense dining room were replaced by more intimate meals in the cozy family kitchen, often prepared by both amidst laughter and confidences. The corridors, once traversed with solitary steps, now echoed with the sound of their animated conversations, of their passionate debates about art, business, or simply about the small details of everyday life. The separate rooms became a distant memory. Now they shared not only the same bed, but also the same dreams, the same fears, the same hopes. Of course, the transformation was not without its challenges. Dominic's aunt, Lady Beatrice Sterling, the family matriarch, initially viewed the sudden and inexplicable change in her nephew and the growing influence of this country girl over him with deep suspicion and no small hostility. She feared that Eleanor, with her naivety and lack of worldly experience, would distract Dominic from his responsibilities at the head of the Sterling Empire. Or worse, that she was a cunning fortune hunter disguised as a sensitive artist. There were several tense family dinners, veiled comments, and subtle attempts at sabotage by Lady Beatrice and some envious cousins who saw their own position in the family and business structure in jeopardy. But Dominic, this time, stood firm. He defended Eleanor with a loyalty and passion that left his family speechless. He made it very clear that Eleanor was his wife, the woman he loved, and that any disrespect towards her would be considered a personal affront to himself. And Eleanor, far from being intimidated by the hostility of the Sterlings, demonstrated a strength of character, an intelligence, and a dignity that gradually earned her the reluctant respect of most of them. Even Lady Beatrice, in time, had to admit, if only to herself, that the young woman had something special, a light of her own that had achieved what no one else had managed, to soften her nephew's icy heart and make him happy. Eleanor's success as a jewelry designer under the brand Soul Sparkle continued to grow exponentially. Her unique and emotionally charged creations were coveted by elegant women around the world. She opened her first boutique in the exclusive Bond Street district, then another in Paris, in New York, in Dubai. Dominic, using his vast business experience and international network of contacts, supported her every step of the way, acting not only as her proud husband, but also as her most enthusiastic partner and mentor. He discovered an unexpected pleasure in helping her build her own empire, an empire based not on power and control, but on beauty, creativity, and passion. Together as a couple and as partners, Dominic and Eleanor became an example of how two seemingly opposite worlds can merge to create something new and extraordinary. They learned to balance their successful careers with their personal lives, to find time for themselves, to travel, to cultivate their shared passions and also their individual spaces. And of course, they started a family. A few years after that magical night of the masked ball, their twin children, a boy and a girl, were born, filling Sterling Manor with a joy and vitality it had never known before. Dominic, the CEO who had once feared commitment and vulnerability, became a devoted and loving father, discovering in fatherhood a source of happiness and fulfillment much deeper and more lasting than any business success. And Eleanor, the young woman who had arrived at that house as a contract bride, became the heart and soul of a united, strong, and loving family. The original marriage contract, the one that had stipulated 5 years of pretense without love or intimacy, remained forgotten at the bottom of a drawer, a simple yellowed paper that no longer had any meaning or validity. It had been replaced by a much more powerful pact, a pact sealed not with ink and signatures, but with kisses, caresses, shared tears, complicit laughter, and the daily promise of a love that, although it had been born from the strangest and most improbable circumstances, had proven to be stronger than any rule, any fear, any secret from the past. One night, many years later, as they celebrated their 15th wedding anniversary, the 10th if counted from their true beginning, sitting on the terrace of their home in Tuscany, watching a dreamlike sunset, Eleanor nestled close to Dominic and whispered in his ear, "Do you remember, my love, that first night? How scared I was, how cold and distant you seemed. Who would have thought then that we would end up like this? So happy." Dominic hugged her tenderly, kissing her hair, which now sported elegant silver streaks, just like his own. "I suppose sometimes, my dear Eleanor, Fate has very strange ways of writing the most beautiful love stories, and I will be eternally grateful to it for having broken my own rules that night. It was the best decision of my life, because that night, without knowing it, I found not only a wife, but my soulmate, my best friend, the mother of my children, the love of my life. You, Eleanor, are my true contract, the only one that matters, a contract sealed with the heart and destined to last forever. And as the stars began to shine in the Tuscan sky, they kissed with the same passion as that first night, but now with the serenity and depth of a love that had overcome all trials, that had broken down all barriers, and that had become their most precious and lasting legacy. The story of Dominic and Eleanor, the CEO and the contract bride, became a beautiful testament that true love can arise in the most unexpected places, defying all rules, all fears, and transforming two lives forever into a perfect symphony of passion, respect, and shared happiness. A contract, strict rules, and a wedding night that changed everything. The story of Dominic and Eleanor shows us that the heart has reasons that reason does not understand, and that sometimes breaking one's own barriers is the first step to finding true love. What began as an agreement of convenience transformed, thanks to the magic of one night and the courage of two souls willing to risk everything, into a story of passion, redemption, and a happiness that would last a lifetime. If this passionate story of a love that defied all contracts has touched your heart, give this video a like, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our narratives that will make you believe in the transformative power of love, and activate notifications. Do you believe that an arranged marriage can truly turn into a true love story? What rule would you be willing to break for the person you love? Share your valuable opinion in the comments, and tell us from which wonderful country you are watching us. Your support is the spark that ignites the flame of our stories.